She reached for his hand, and the moment her fingers brushed his skin, a shiver ran through her entire body. Not the cold of winter, not the thrill of fear, but something older, something feral. It was as if she had touched a thread that stretched beyond centuries, a pulse that belonged to a creature hidden beneath the mask of humanity. The hand she held was not warm, not alive in the way she understood life. It carried a weight, a silence that seemed to swallow the world around her. People walk through cities unaware, blinded by routine, never suspecting the shadows that moved just beyond comprehension, just beyond sight. Yet here she was, staring at a truth she had no right to behold. He had been a man once, or so she was told. History remembers him as ordinary, a name in a ledger, a figure in photographs and faded letters. But what she now saw was the anatomy of a life stretched across generations. The veins beneath his skin pulsed with a rhythm that defied human biology. The nails, too long, too perfect, too deliberate, as though they had been honed over lifetimes, not decades. And the smell, metallic, like iron soaked in something unholy, made her stomach twist. No one could explain it. No historian, no scientist, no priest. They had all been told the story of his death, the comforting tale meant to soothe the curious. But death, she realized, is a narrative written by those who fear what lies beneath it. And this hand, now entwined with hers, was proof that some truths are too dangerous, too vast, to be recorded in textbooks or whispered in classrooms. She wanted to pull back, to run, to escape this impossible intimacy with something monstrous yet familiar. Yet the hand gripped hers with an authority that was almost intimate, as if it recognized her in a way no human hand ever could. It whispered secrets in a language older than empires, a language made of instinct and terror. And for the first time, she understood that the world she had known, the safe, structured, banal world of schedules and rules, was an illusion. There are forces beneath the surface of humanity that shape everything. The rise and fall of kings, the hidden rituals in the shadows, the psychological levers of control pulled by hands she could not yet see. And this hand, was the conduit, the living bridge between her fragile reality and a truth that could consume her mind, her identity, and her very soul. Her mind raced, struggling to reconcile the familiar shape of a man she thought she knew with the alien, predatory essence now fused to her own nervous system through that single touch. Each heartbeat of his hand echoed in her chest, not like a reflection, but as a command, a silent demand she could neither ignore nor fully understand. Memories she had never lived, lives she could not have experienced, flickered behind her eyes. Images of opulent halls where whispers shaped destiny, of bloodless ceremonies in the dead of night, of faces smiling as empires bent to unseen wills. It was as if touching him unlocked a hidden archive of power and corruption, a record of humanity's darkest bargains signed in secrecy and sealed with obedience. And in that revelation came a sinking, almost unbearable awareness. Every institution she trusted, every law, every moral boundary, every notion of safety, had been constructed to hide what she now held in her palm. The hand, alive in its impossibility, seemed to pulse with a cunning intelligence, tracing patterns on her skin as if mapping the lines of her soul, cataloging her fears, her desires, her weaknesses. She saw the truth in her reflection for the first time, not in the mirror, but in the way her own skin crawled, in the sudden knowledge that she had been selected, chosen not by accident but by design. He had walked among humanity for centuries, unnoticed, untouched by time, gathering secrets that shaped civilizations, and yet, in this moment, he allowed her access. And access was dangerous, intoxicating, because knowledge of the forbidden changes you in ways that cannot be undone. It is a virus that rewires perception, that teaches the body to recognize patterns invisible to the uninitiated, that sharpens intuition into paranoia, and paranoia into awakening. She tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand clarity, but the words choked in her throat, replaced by visions of rituals so precise, so deliberate, that she realized control itself was a weapon wielded silently for centuries. And the hand remained calm, patient, as if aware that the more she resisted, the deeper she would be pulled into the labyrinth of histories and spoken rules, a labyrinth in which one misstep could erase not just memory, but identity, and in which she was already walking blindfolded, tethered only to that unholy appendage guiding her toward revelations mankind was never meant to witness. The room around her dissolved, or perhaps it had never truly existed. The walls, the furniture, the faint hum of the city outside, all irrelevant against the magnitude of what she now confronted. Every sensation sharpened, every shadow seemed to twist with intent, and the hand in haze radiated a presence that defied reason. It was not merely a relic of a man. It was a vessel, a container of agendas older than nations, of conspiracies buried beneath the veneer of civilization, of betrayals executed with surgical precision and never recorded in books. She felt the weight of countless eyes, unseen, unblinking, trained on her through centuries, as though she had stepped into a theater where the actors were ghosts and the scripts had been written in blood. And then she saw it, patterns in her own thought, her impulses, her fears, that were not entirely her own, echoes of influence reaching across generations, the quiet manipulations embedded in culture, religion, and law, designed to shape humanity into predictable lines, obedient bodies, minds that could be steered without ever knowing it. She shuddered as realization set in. She had been living in a constructed reality, where history itself had been tailored, edited, sanitized, and sometimes entirely erased to maintain the illusion of free will. Yet here, touching the impossible hand, she glimpsed the machinery behind the mask, hierarchies built upon fear, institutions maintained through ritualized compliance, knowledge hoarded to control and intimidate, and humans reduced to vessels of ambition they could scarcely comprehend. The hand shifted slightly, and in that imperceptible movement, she felt both invitation and warning, as though the hand were offering a path into the underworld of truth, but at a cost measured in sanity, in moral certainty, in the fragile ego she had once believed was untouchable. She realized that the real power in the world had never been wielded openly. It existed in shadows, in whispers, in systems designed to train obedience without awareness. And for the first time, she understood that the only way to survive such knowledge, the only way to navigate the labyrinth, was to embrace it fully, to step beyond fear and into comprehension, even though every step deeper carried the risk of losing herself entirely. As the hand lingered in haze, she felt a strange resonance, a connection that demanded surrender, not to him, but to the truth he embodied, a truth that mankind had buried and feared, a truth that now pulsed through her veins, insisting that she witness, remember, and ultimately transform time fractured, or perhaps she had simply stepped outside it. The hand she held no longer felt like flesh but like an axis around which reality itself pivoted. Memories of the past, some her own, some not, flooded her mind. Images of hidden councils convened in candlelit chambers where decisions shaped continents, where empires rose and fell at the quiet insistence of invisible hands. And these hands, she realized, were not metaphorical. They were literal, reaching across generations, wielding influence through fear, loyalty, and the silent promise of power. He, or whatever he had become, had lived through these moments, had observed humanity from a vantage no ordinary man could comprehend. And now, by touching him, she had been granted a glimpse into the machinery of dominion, secret societies manipulating economies, religions curated to control masses, rituals designed to instill obedience through symbols, architecture, and subtle psychological nudges. She saw how human ambition could be guided like a river, diverted into channels that served hidden agendas while giving the illusion of freedom. The hand tightened slightly, and she felt an unspoken lesson. Knowledge alone is dangerous. Understanding how to act upon it, how to navigate it without destruction, is rarer still. Every story she had been told, every lesson in history class, every moral she had held sacred, was incomplete, sanitized, and in some cases, intentionally inverted to hide truths too threatening for public consciousness. The subtle horror was in the realization that mankind's greatest crimes often bore the face of virtue, that wars, revolutions, and social upheavals had been orchestrated not merely by ambition, but by the calculated hand of a hidden elite, observing from shadows, ensuring that chaos always fed control. And she understood, viscerally, that the hand she held was both proof and instrument, a bridge between the ordinary world and a dimension of power where morality was irrelevant, where obedience and fear were currency, and where survival demanded more than courage. It demanded insight into the invisible forces that dictated reality itself. And as she stared at it, she felt a cold certainty. She would never again experience the world as she had before. Every glance, every sound, every interaction would now carry the weight of hidden significance, a code she could not unsee, a web she was already entangled in, Guided by the pulse of a hand that was no longer merely human, her mind trembled under the weight of recognition. She was no longer merely an observer. By touching the hand, she had become part of a lineage of witnesses, chosen or cursed, who saw the mechanisms of power in their raw, unvarnished form. It was not just history that had been manipulated, but perception itself. She realized that civilizations had been sculpted not through open conquest alone, but through the invisible architectures of control, the subtle shaping of belief, the selective erasure of inconvenient truths, the elevation of lies into sacred dogma. Every institution she had trusted, religion, government, science, education, was both a guide and a prison, a structure designed to channel human thought and desire toward ends the majority could never comprehend. And yet, she was granted access, not as a reward, but as a trial. The hand pulsed, communicating in silence, as though it were both mentor and interrogator, teaching her to recognize the threads of manipulation interwoven through society, the codes hidden in plain sight. She saw merchants, kings, generals, and priests not as autonomous actors but as vessels carrying orders from forces beyond comprehension, bound by invisible contracts written in secrecy, enforced by rituals that survived millennia. She felt the echo of every deceit, every conspiracy that had shaped history, the fire set to conceal inconvenient knowledge, the assassinations that silenced truth, the propaganda that rewired entire populations. And the most horrifying revelation of all, human beings were complicit, willingly or unknowingly, in their own subjugation, obeying symbols and signals they were trained to respond to before birth. The hand shifted again, brushing against her palm in a way that was almost affectionate, almost human, yet beneath it lay a cold calculus, a reminder that power never forgives weakness, and curiosity is only safe when paired with comprehension. She realized that she had been blind not because the world hid itself, but because humanity had agreed to be blind, sacrificing awareness for comfort, for order, for the illusion of freedom. And now, tethered to the impossible hand, she stood on the precipice of knowledge that could dismantle not only her understanding of the world but her own identity. Every heartbeat, every subtle movement of the hand, was a call to awaken, to see beyond illusion, to trace the lines of influence that dictated lives, choices, and fates, until nothing remained sacred, nothing remained untouched, and she understood that the price of seeing the truth was the permanent dissolution of innocence. She felt a cold clarity settle over her as the implications of what she held sank in. This hand, impossibly alive, was a repository of memory and intent, a vessel carrying knowledge mankind was never meant to access, yet here it was, pressing against her palm, demanding recognition. With it came a vision of a world built not on chance or moral virtue, but on precise manipulation. Wars ignited in whispers, revolutions steered through invisible currents, leaders raised and toppled by forces operating behind screens, behind curtains, in back rooms lit by candlelight where no cameras could reach. She realized that every story of heroism, every narrative of justice, had layers of deception hidden within it. The narratives were tools, constructed to keep humanity pacified, distracted, obedient. The hand seemed to pulse in rhythm with her thoughts, as if aware of the questions she hadn't yet spoken, aware of the terror and mingling in her veins, aware that comprehension of such patterns could fracture the mind or elevate it beyond ordinary perception. She saw lines of power stretching back centuries, connecting dynasties, secret orders, occult knowledge, and psychological conditioning that had trained generations to obey silently, to never question, to accept limitations imposed from above. And the most sinister realization clawed its way into her consciousness. She was not the first to hold this hand, and she would not be the last. The hand was both sentinel and teacher, transmitting lessons through touch, through proximity, through a silent, unbreakable insistence on understanding. Her body reacted instinctively, heart racing, sweat slicking her skin, as visions of ritualized control and human compliance surged forward, ceremonies designed to imprint obedience, symbols etched into architecture and art to manipulate thoughts subconsciously, codes embedded in music, literature, and religious rites to enforce conformity without awareness. And yet, amid the terror, a dangerous curiosity bloomed, a recognition that knowing these mechanisms gave her power. The hand had extended an invitation to witness, to comprehend, to navigate this hidden architecture of domination. But power, she understood instinctively, is never neutral. To possess it is to inherit responsibility, to carry a burden that could consume the soul if mismanaged. And as the shadows in the room deepened, as the pulse of the hand resonated through her body like a dark heartbeat, she understood a fundamental truth. To truly see the world as it is, to understand the forces shaping every choice and every life, one must be willing to descend into darkness, to confront the machinery of control, and to accept that once awakened, ignorance is no longer an option. The silence around her thickened, but it was not empty. It was alive with the weight of centuries, humming with the quiet insistence of secrets that had been protected at any cost. She realized that the hand she held was a key, not just to knowledge, but to a reality that had always existed alongside Hayes, invisible yet inexorably shaping every structure, every law, every truth humanity clung to. It was as if history itself had been a veil, a performance stage to distract the masses from the patterns that governed them, patterns she could now see with terrifying clarity. Kings and presidents, scholars and generals, priests and philosophers, every one of them actors in a theater run by unseen directors, manipulated by codes, rituals, and psychological frameworks designed to elicit compliance. And she understood, with a chill that struck straight to her bones, that the hand had been part of that theater, a witness to every manipulation, every betrayal, every carefully curated lie. And now, through her touch, it was transmitting its memory, demanding that she see what had been hidden. Her mind filled with images of shadowed councils, faces she could not place yet knew intimately, discussions in languages she did not speak yet somehow understood, strategies executed with surgical precision that altered the course of nations. The sheer scale of it threatened to overwhelm her, and she felt panic rise, a primitive instinct to flee, to reject the impossible intimacy with knowledge she was never meant to have. But the hand held firm, its presence both warning and invitation, teaching her that survival here required more than fear. It required understanding the invisible structures, the subtle levers of influence, the psychological mechanisms designed to enslave entire populations while leaving them convinced they were free. And in that moment, she felt a transformation begin, the first stirrings of a consciousness that could perceive the unseen, trace the hidden currents, and recognize the deliberate architecture of control embedded in every institution, every law, every cultural norm. She felt her own thoughts being catalogued, measured, and mirrored by the hand, as if it were training her to see patterns, to anticipate manipulations, to decode the choreography of obedience humans had been conditioned to perform without question. And with that understanding came a burden heavier than any physical weight. Knowledge alone was no protection. Comprehension without mastery was vulnerability. She realized she was now part of a lineage of watchers, chosen, or cursed, to witness the machinery of power, and that the moment she returned to the ordinary world, she would never again perceive it as ordinary, for the invisible forces shaping reality had been revealed, and there was no turning away from a truth so absolute that it consumed the very foundations of her reality. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest as though reality were responding to the touch she had made. The hand in hers was no longer just a conduit. It was a teacher, a sentinel, a force that demanded recognition of the patterns humanity had been blind to for centuries. She saw how history had been choreographed, how entire civilizations had danced to rhythms they could neither hear nor understand. Wars were not fought for land or resources but for control of belief, for the silent conditioning of minds and souls. Revolutions were orchestrated to consolidate hidden power, religion sculpted to maintain obedience, and knowledge carefully rationed to shape perception while concealing the true architecture of domination. And in that revelation, the terror was exquisite. Every institution she trusted, every figure of authority, every moral compass had been manipulated, calibrated, and, in some cases, invented to serve invisible agendas. The hand shifted slightly, and with that subtle movement, she felt a pulse, a communication, a directive to see beyond fear into comprehension, to track the threads connecting human action to hidden design. Her mind became a map of influence, a lattice of control mechanisms interwoven into society at every level, economic, cultural, psychological, and spiritual. And then came the recognition that she herself had been part of this system, unknowingly. Every decision, every fear, every desire subtly guided by forces she had dismissed as coincidence or intuition. The hand pulsed again, a rhythm she could feel in her bones, as if drawing out the latent potential to perceive what others could not, to understand the rules of a game most humans never knew existed. She realized that to survive, To navigate this unseen world without being consumed by it, she would need to abandon conventional morality, to discard simplistic notions of right and wrong, and instead learn to read power, influence, and control as a language. And in that moment, the magnitude of her exposure became unbearable. She was tethered to a truth so vast, so forbidden, that to speak of it would be to risk her sanity. To ignore it would be to live a lie. Yet the hand remained patient, almost intimate, guiding her, teaching her, and she understood that she had crossed a threshold. There was no return. The knowledge it imparted would follow her, whispering in the margins of thought, tracing the hidden levers in every interaction, revealing the invisible architects shaping her life, and demanding that she not only witness but learn to navigate, and perhaps even wield. The very forces humanity had long feared to confront. Her breath became shallow as the gravity of realization pressed deeper into her chest, because now she could sense how carefully this world had been trained to ignore itself. The hand remained steady, unnervingly calm, as if time had surrendered its authority the moment she touched it. Through that contact, she began to recognize the most dangerous form of power ever created: invisibility through normalization. Control did not arrive as tyranny, it arrived as routine. It wore the face of policy, tradition, progress. She saw how entire populations had been conditioned to police themselves, to censor their instincts, to mistrust the quiet alarms in their own bodies. Fear was not imposed, it was cultivated, curated, and maintained like a resource. The hand conveyed this not as accusation, but as instruction, revealing how rituals of authority were embedded into daily life. Schedules replacing intuition, credentials replacing wisdom, compliance rewarded as virtue. And beneath it all lay a hidden agreement humanity had made long ago, to trade perception for comfort, awareness for security. She felt a sickness rise when she understood that resistance had been anticipated, studied, and neutralized generations before her birth. Dissent was permitted, even encouraged, as long as it remained contained within pre-approved boundaries. The illusion of choice was the most effective prison ever devised. The hand tightened, ever so slightly, and a new layer unfolded. How those who glimpsed too much were never erased outright, but instead discredited, exhausted, absorbed, or turned against one another. Truth was not forbidden, it was fragmented until it lost its power. And now she saw the role she had unknowingly played, repeating narratives, enforcing norms, dismissing instincts that threatened the structure. The horror was not that monsters ruled the world, but that humans did, willingly, under rules written by something older, colder, and far more patient than any tyrant. The hand remained there, unwavering, a silent witness to her unraveling certainty, reminding her that awakening was not a moment of triumph but of isolation. Because once you see the architecture of control, you can no longer unsee it. Every smile becomes measured, every promise becomes suspect, every authority figure becomes a question mark. And as the silence stretched, she understood that this descent had only begun, that the hand had shown her the map, but had not yet revealed the cost of walking it. She could feel the weight of the centuries pressing through the hand, like a living archive of humanity's hidden sins, triumphs, and manipulations. Each pulse carried memories she could not place, yet somehow knew were true. The rise and fall of dynasties, the silent engineering of revolutions, the subtle orchestration of obedience through rituals, laws, and myths. And in that oppressive clarity, she realized that what she held was more than a hand. It was a repository of control itself, a living testament to how power could be preserved and wielded across generations without ever being questioned. The world she had trusted, with its rules, hierarchies, and moral certainties, was revealed as a stage, its actors dancing to scripts written by forces she had only glimpsed through history books, rumors, and fragments of forbidden knowledge. She understood, viscerally, that humans are trained from birth to participate in this grand design, absorbing symbols, narratives, and behaviors that ensure compliance, often without ever recognizing it. The hand pulsed again, and with that subtle rhythm, she felt herself learning to see the invisible scaffolding, the coded messages hidden in architecture, art, literature, religion, the psychological levers that orchestrated behavior, the patterns of faith, loyalty, and desire carefully tuned to maintain order while concealing true power. And then the thought struck her, cold and inevitable. She had become part of this system merely by witnessing it. Knowledge, she realized, is both power and danger, a force that can transform or destroy depending on how it is used. She felt an almost predatory awareness of her surroundings, as if the hand were teaching her to sense intent, to perceive manipulation before it was enacted, to recognize the subtle cues that reveal hidden agendas. And with that awareness came a terrifying truth. Humans rarely recognize the architects of their own lives. They walk blindfolded through a maze of influence, oblivious to the strings that guide their every choice. The hand, impossibly alive, conveyed patience and authority, forcing her to confront the raw mechanics of control without flinching, without retreat. And as the shadows in the room deepened, she realized that what she held was not a tool to be possessed lightly. It was a key to forbidden knowledge, a portal into truths that could not be unseen, a responsibility that would follow her for the rest of her life, binding her to a reality from which ignorance would never again protect her. The hand shifted in haze, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet the movement carried intent, a silent communication older than any language she had ever known. She felt it guiding her awareness, drawing her attention to layers of reality she had been blind to all her life. The invisible structures of influence, the rituals performed in shadows, the silent codes that dictated obedience and shaped civilization. Entire governments, entire religions, entire societies had been built upon these hidden patterns, their architects unseen, their methods unrecorded, their motives unfathomable to the uninitiated. And yet, pressed against her skin, was the embodiment of that knowledge, transmitting not just information, but instinct, perception, and a terrifying sense of responsibility. She realized that this hand had touched countless others before her, shaping minds, guiding destinies, instilling understanding, and leaving some irrevocably changed, lost, or broken. The awareness it imparted was dangerous, intoxicating, and irreversible. Once perceived, the hidden architecture of the world could never be ignored. Her thoughts raced as she connected dots previously invisible, symbols in public monuments, repeated themes in art, carefully orchestrated crises that redirected entire populations, all threads in a tapestry of control, invisible to those unwilling to look. And the hand seemed to reinforce a truth she could not escape. Power is never obvious, obedience is never forced, and manipulation is most effective when it masquerades as freedom. The terror of realization was almost physical, a tightening in her chest, a trembling in her fingers, yet it was accompanied by an irresistible pull toward comprehension. She understood that to ignore these lessons was to remain blind, complicit, and vulnerable. To engage with them was to risk everything, including her own sense of self, but also to gain insight few could ever claim. And in that silent, electrifying exchange, she felt the first stirrings of transformation, her mind sharpening, her intuition heightening, her perception aligning with the rhythms of control itself. The hand pulsed again, insistently, like a heartbeat she shared, and with it came a whisper of inevitability. Once you know the machinery, you cannot unsee it. Once you feel its rhythm, you cannot return to ignorance. And she realized, with a mixture of awe and dread, that she had been inducted into a hidden lineage of awareness, a line of witnesses to humanity's unspoken truths, tethered forever to the currents of influence, power, and manipulation that shaped the world beneath. The illusion of freedom, her pulse raced as the implications of the hand's presence sank deeper into her consciousness. She was no longer simply observing history. She was experiencing it, feeling the invisible currents of control that had guided humanity for centuries. Wars, revolutions, and empires, all were no longer abstract events but calculated movements, orchestrated with precision. Each ripple in human behavior anticipated, each decision preordained by forces operating from the shadows. She realized that obedience had always been subtle, embedded in rituals, stories, and the structures humans accepted as natural. Symbols, ceremonies, and traditions were not mere culture. They were instruments of control, conditioning minds to follow without question. And the hand in haze pulsed with the memory of every manipulation, every subtle coercion, every silent victory of hidden power. She began to see the invisible web connecting families, institutions, religions, and governments, a network so vast that it had always been imperceptible to ordinary perception. And then came the awareness that knowledge alone was insufficient. Understanding how to navigate the hidden architecture required a new kind of discipline, a comprehension that could not be taught, only absorbed through experience, patience, and exposure to the rhythm of control itself. The hand guided her awareness, teaching her to sense influence as instinct, to detect manipulation before it unfolded, to read subtle cues invisible to the untrained mind. And with that teaching came an even darker truth. Most humans never question the world because questioning itself is dangerous. To perceive the machinery of power is to inherit responsibility. To ignore it is to remain a pawn. She felt a strange exhilaration mixed with terror, a recognition that her life, and perhaps the lives of countless others, would never again exist in ignorance. She understood that the hand had chosen her for this moment, not as a reward, but as an induction into a lineage of watchers, witnesses to the mechanism shaping the world. And as she held it, feeling its pulse and silent instruction, she realized that humanity's history, what she had been taught, what she had believed, was a carefully constructed illusion, a veil over truths far darker, more precise, and more deliberate than she could have imagined. The hand's rhythm matched her own heartbeat now, entwining her perception, and she understood, in the marrow of her bones, that she had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, ignorance would be impossible, and the world she thought she knew had revealed itself as a stage for forces too calculated, too patient, and too dangerous to confront lightly. She began to feel the weight of every secret the hand had carried, pressing into her consciousness as if centuries of hidden agendas, betrayals, and forbidden rituals were being downloaded directly into her mind. Every pulse, every subtle movement, conveyed lessons too vast and intricate for ordinary comprehension. How belief could be engineered, how loyalty could be earned and extracted without a word, how fear could be woven into the very fabric of society until it became instinct rather than thought. She saw the subtle levers of influence embedded in art, architecture, religion, and law, and how they had guided human behavior for millennia, directing entire populations like chess pieces toward outcomes chosen long before anyone suspected. The magnitude of it threatened to overwhelm her, yet she could not pull away. The hand's presence was magnetic, commanding attention, forcing understanding. It was teaching her to see through the veil, to recognize the hidden lines of power, to perceive the mechanisms that most humans never even realized existed. And with that awareness came a chilling responsibility. The knowledge could not be ignored, and to act without comprehension was more dangerous than ignorance itself. She realized that the hand had touched countless lives before Hayes, each recipient forever altered, each witness forced to confront the machinery of power, the dark symmetry of influence, and the deliberate architecture of control. As the hand pulsed, she understood its dual nature. It was both teacher and sentinel, revealing truths while testing endurance, transmitting awareness while gauging readiness. And she saw the pattern of history not as random events or moral triumphs, but as a carefully curated sequence designed to maintain order, conceal true power, and cultivate obedience through subtle, almost imperceptible psychological pressure. The air around her felt thick with intent, every shadow suggesting unseen watchers, every sound carrying significance she could now perceive. And in that terrifying clarity, she understood the ultimate lesson. Humans are rarely free. Freedom is an illusion maintained by distraction, ritual, and the careful orchestration of perception. The hand pulsed again, synchronizing with her own heartbeat, and she felt the transformation begin. Her awareness sharpened, her intuition heightened, her ability to see the invisible patterns of control blossoming like a dangerous, forbidden seed. And she knew, in the core of her being, that this was only the beginning. The descent into truth, once begun, could not be undone, and the world she had known was gone forever, replaced by the cold, precise, and unrelenting machinery of hidden power. She was now destined to navigate. Her vision sharpened, but it was a clarity that terrified rather than comforted. Through the hand, she began to perceive the invisible hierarchies guiding humanity, the silent architects manipulating behavior and perception from shadows where no light could reach. She saw how entire generations had been trained, conditioned to follow patterns they could not name, responding instinctively to symbols, ceremonies, and narratives designed to preserve control. Empires rose and fell not by the strength of armies alone, but by psychological precision, by the careful orchestration of belief, fear, and loyalty, each moment calculated to ensure obedience. The hand pulsed, subtly, insistently, like a teacher marking the rhythm of comprehension, pressing lessons into her nervous system that no spoken words could convey. She recognized the architecture of manipulation woven into religion, politics, economics, and culture, each strand invisible to those unwilling or untrained to perceive it. And with that realization came a profound, almost physical horror. Humanity itself had been a stage, and she, like countless others before her, had been both audience and actor, guided by invisible strings she had only now begun to see. The hand conveyed not only the mechanics of control, but the scale of its ambition, centuries of influence, carefully hidden, perpetuated with surgical patience, enforced by fear and desire alike. And she felt the intimate weight of responsibility pressing down. Knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unlearned, and the burden of awareness is heavier than ignorance. She sensed the legacy of those who had held the hand. Before her, individuals transformed, some enlightened, some broken, all altered irreversibly by the insight it delivered. It was a lineage of watchers, of witnesses to humanity's hidden mechanisms, and she had been initiated, whether by chance or design, into this continuum. Her perception of morality shifted. Simple notions of right and wrong were inadequate in the face of a reality ruled by systems, not conscience. And as the hand pulsed in time with her heartbeat, she felt her instincts sharpen, her intuition awaken, her understanding of hidden agendas and subtle psychological levers deepen. The shadows around her seemed to ripple with awareness, as if the room itself acknowledged her transformation. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that once she stepped fully into comprehension, there would be no turning back. The world of ignorance she had known would vanish entirely, leaving only the machinery of control, the web of hidden influence, and the silent insistence of the hand guiding her into truths too dangerous, too profound, and too permanent to ignore. Her awareness expanded, but with expansion came disorientation. The hand she held was not merely a relic of power, but an anchor to a hidden world operating parallel to her own. She began to perceive the subtle choreography of human behavior across history, the invisible strings that guided thoughts, desires, and decisions without detection. The hand pulsed again, teaching her instinctively to sense influence, to recognize manipulation before it was executed, to understand the deliberate construction of obedience across centuries. She saw networks of hidden alliances, secret councils, and covert rituals designed to shape humanity while keeping the majority blind to the machinery controlling their lives. Entire populations were trained to comply, to idolize, to fear, to repeat behaviors passed down through generations without questioning origin or intent. And yet, here, pressed against her palm, was the living proof of it all, a vessel of knowledge, experience, and influence beyond human comprehension, waiting for those capable of perceiving its lessons. The weight of it was almost physical, pressing into her mind and body, demanding recognition of patterns previously invisible, demanding the acknowledgement that ignorance was no longer an option. Every instinct, every impulse, every cognitive response she had trusted before was now reframed. She was learning to perceive the architecture behind perception itself, the scaffolding of control hidden beneath the surface of reality. And with that understanding came an unshakable, primal truth. Those who perceive the hidden levers of power are mocked. They cannot return to innocence. They cannot remain ignorant. The hand conveyed both warning and instruction, showing her the paths to comprehension, the dangers of misuse, and the responsibilities inherent in awakening to truths that mankind had deliberately concealed. She felt her mind aligning with the pulse, her intuition sharpening into a dangerous precision, her perception stretching to encompass patterns that most could never see. And in that moment, she realized the ultimate paradox. Knowledge was power, but power was peril, and comprehension came at a cost measured in fear, identity, and the permanent dissolution of previously held certainties. The shadows seemed to lean closer, as if aware she now walked between worlds, the ordinary and the forbidden, and the hand's silent insistence reminded her that the descent into truth was ongoing, inevitable, and irreversible. Every thought, every sensation, every heartbeat was now tethered to the rhythm of forbidden knowledge, and she understood, deep in her bones, that once the veil was lifted, she would never again perceive humanity, or herself. In the naive simplicity of ignorance, the hand pulsed in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat, and with every subtle contraction, she felt knowledge seeping into her awareness, knowledge that had been forbidden, erased, or deliberately concealed. It was not mere history she perceived, but the mechanics behind history, the patterns of influence, the deliberate manipulations of perception, the rituals and codes designed to maintain control across generations. Entire societies had been guided like rivers along precise channels, their inhabitants convinced of freedom while obedience was engineered invisibly, subtly, irresistibly. She understood that the hand was a vessel of this understanding, alive not in flesh alone but in the transmission of strategy, instinct, and perception honed over centuries. And as she held it, her mind filled with visions of shadowed councils, silent ceremonies, and orchestrated events that shaped entire populations without their awareness, wars designed to consolidate unseen power, revolutions carefully steered to eliminate threats while preserving the illusion of chaos, leaders trained to act within scripts dictated by forces invisible to public scrutiny. She realized with a shock that what she had considered randomness, what she had believed to be individual choice, was largely illusion. Human behavior was anticipated, conditioned, and guided by systems too vast and precise for ordinary perception. The hand seemed to communicate this, not through words, but through instinct, pulling her cognition toward patterns, causal chains, and hidden networks. And with the revelation came terror. Those who perceive the machinery cannot unsee it, cannot return to the comforting ignorance of the crowd. Knowledge is seductive, intoxicating, but it is also perilous. Comprehension of such systems carries responsibility that could destroy a mind unprepared. She felt a transformation begin within her, a sharpening of awareness, an alignment with the hidden rhythms of influence, and an instinctive capacity to detect manipulation before it unfolds. And yet, intertwined with this awakening was a warning, almost tactile. To navigate these truths safely, she must learn discipline, patience, and restraint, or risk being consumed by the very forces she now understood. The shadows in the room seemed to shift with her awareness, the air heavy with expectation, as if the unseen architects of history themselves acknowledged her perception. And she understood, chillingly, that the hand was not just a tool, but a test, a crucible through which she would either emerge transformed, capable of navigating the hidden world of control, or be shattered by truths far older and far darker than she had ever imagined possible. Her vision began to fracture and expand simultaneously. A terrifying duality of perception where the ordinary world and the hidden machinery of control overlaid each other. The hand pulsed again, and with it came the full weight of awareness, the recognition that humanity was an intricate network of influence, manipulation, and carefully engineered obedience. Every symbol, every ceremony, every cultural norm was a tool, a lever, a subtle instrument of control honed over centuries. She saw how leaders were groomed, not merely to rule, but to perpetuate systems they did not understand. How revolutions and rebellions were anticipated, guided, and contained, and how human instinct could be trained and exploited with near-perfect precision. The hand pressed a rhythm into her consciousness that mirrored the patterns of human behavior itself, and she realized she was learning to read influence as instinct, to perceive control in action before it could manifest. And then came the darker truth. This knowledge was not neutral, it was power, and power demanded accountability. Every revelation carried consequences, and she understood that witnessing these patterns forced a choice, either to participate consciously, mastering the currents of influence, or to remain passive, risking annihilation by the very system she now perceived. She saw the lineage of those who had held the hand before her, individuals who had been awakened, transformed, or destroyed, each one a testament to the peril and potency of forbidden awareness. And as the shadows seemed to lean closer, alive with intent, she recognized the silent imperative. Comprehension was not enough. Mastery was required. Fear and exhilaration intertwined, a visceral recognition that she had crossed a threshold from which innocence could never return. The hand pulsed again, and she felt its memory, centuries of observation, guidance, and subtle intervention, a living archive of manipulation and power. It was teaching her to navigate the invisible structures, to recognize patterns invisible to the untrained mind, to trace influence through generations and across civilizations. And in that teaching, she understood that humanity's freedom was mostly illusion, that most humans live and die blindfolded, dancing to rhythms they never hear. Yet here, in her grasp, was the tool to see clearly, to understand the hidden currents, and to shape them with awareness, a gift, a burden, and a danger all at once. She realized that the descent into truth was only beginning, and the hand would guide her, relentlessly, through corridors of forbidden knowledge few could survive unscathed. Her perception sharpened to an almost unbearable degree, as though the hand was tuning her senses to frequencies humans were never meant to detect. She saw the world not as a collection of random events, but as an intricate network of design and intention, where every human decision, every cultural ritual, every law, and every symbol was carefully calibrated to maintain order, obedience, and control. The hand pulsed in her grasp, a silent instructor transmitting centuries of experience, showing her how influence spreads invisibly, subtly, inexorably, like a tide beneath the calm surface of life. She understood that revolutions, wars, and even moments of apparent freedom were rarely spontaneous. They were anticipated, guided, and, in some cases, orchestrated to serve the hidden agendas of those who had learned to see the patterns and act upon them. And with that knowledge came a visceral horror. The realization that most of humanity is blind by design, conditioned to respond to cues invisible to the ordinary mind, manipulated by forces invisible yet meticulously precise. Every instinct she had trusted now seemed suspect. Her thoughts were not fully her own but had been subtly shaped by currents she could now perceive. The hand pulsed again, and she felt it teaching her to untangle the threads of manipulation, to detect influence before it became action, to anticipate outcomes with the precision of a mind attuned to the hidden architecture of power. And yet, amid the terror and the revelations, an intoxicating curiosity took hold. The power to perceive these patterns, to understand and navigate the invisible levers of control, was within her grasp. She felt herself awakening to a dangerous clarity, a capacity to see beyond illusion and recognize the mechanisms that guide humanity. The hand carried not just knowledge but intent, insisting that she comprehend not only the what but the how and why of control, that she grasp the rules without being consumed by them. Shadows seemed to shift in acknowledgement, the air heavy with expectation, as if the unseen architects of history themselves were aware she had begun to perceive. And in that charged silence, she realized the inevitable truth. The world she had known, safe, orderly, comprehensible, was gone. There was only the machinery of influence, the web of hidden forces, and the pulse of the hand, guiding her deeper into forbidden knowledge, shaping her awareness, and marking her irrevocably as someone who could never again walk blind among men. She felt the hand shift again, a subtle, deliberate movement that reverberated through her consciousness like a pulse of forbidden understanding. The weight of its history pressed down upon her, not with physical force, but with the gravity of centuries of observation, manipulation, and control. She began to perceive the lineage of those who had held it before her, witnesses to the hidden architecture of human behavior, each marked and transformed, some enlightened, some broken, all forever altered by the knowledge it imparted. And she understood, with a chill that sank into her bones, that what she now experienced was not mere revelation, but initiation into a continuum of awareness, a secret heritage of perception that had guided civilizations from the shadows. The hand's pulse seemed to synchronize with the rhythms of influence itself, teaching her to detect subtle levers of control, the shaping of culture through symbols, the manipulation of loyalty and fear, the orchestration of events so that populations act as if freely, even while every major decision is anticipated and guided. She saw how myths, religions, art, and political systems had been engineered to enforce obedience invisibly, and she realized that most humans live and die blindfolded by design. And yet, the hand did not simply reveal, it instructed. It conveyed instinct, intuition, the capacity to recognize manipulation before it occurs, to sense intent in the faintest of cues, to perceive patterns that span centuries. Her mind strained under the influx of awareness, oscillating between awe, terror, and the dangerous exhilaration of forbidden knowledge. And then she felt the weight of responsibility pressing against her consciousness. Knowledge is power, but without mastery, power can destroy. The hand seemed to insist upon discipline, patience, and precision, teaching her not only to see, but to navigate the hidden currents of influence that shape humanity. Shadows deepened around her as her perception stretched, illuminating the invisible strings that guide action, the codes hidden in plain sight, the rituals that shape obedience, and the architecture of control embedded in every layer of society. She understood, chillingly, that ignorance had been her protection until now, and that once fully awakened, she would be tethered to a reality of precision, manipulation, and hidden agendas. The hand pulsed again, silently demanding recognition. Comprehension is not optional, it is a necessity, and the descent into truth is irrevocable, binding her to the machinery of power and the dangerous lineage of knowledge she had now joined. Her perception now existed on two planes, the visible, ordinary world she once trusted, and the hidden framework of control that the hand revealed in every subtle vibration. She saw how human behavior had been meticulously guided, how entire societies had been molded through unseen mechanisms, and how obedience had been cultivated across generations with almost surgical precision. Every law, every ritual, every act of devotion or rebellion was part of a vast system designed to shape minds without resistance. And yet, in the pulse of the hand, she felt not just revelation, but instruction, an initiation into a dangerous awareness, a subtle teaching that whispered, without words, how to navigate this architecture of power. Her mind was flooded with patterns, the invisible levers of influence, the manipulation of desire and fear, the orchestration of events that appear random but are, in fact, deliberate. She realized that comprehension of these forces is intoxicating, addictive, but perilous, for knowledge alone is not mastery. It can destroy the unprepared. And here, for the first time, the hand seemed to reach beyond herself, as if connecting her to a lineage of others who had been awakened, each a witness, each transformed, each tested. And in that moment, she understood a deeper truth. Awareness is a kind of covenant. It demands action, insight, and courage, or it becomes a burden too heavy to bear. Now, as she felt the hand's rhythm align with her own, she understood that her mind had been rewired, attuned to perceive influence, manipulation, and hidden agendas as instinct. And she sensed the first symbolic threshold of transformation. She was being asked to recognize her identity as one who sees, one who understands, one who has crossed into a realm of forbidden awareness. She felt a silent command, a subtle insistence that she affirm her awakening, to signal her acceptance of this dangerous knowledge. And in that recognition, she realized the necessity of ritual, even a simple one, to lock in comprehension, to seal her transformation. She paused, trembling, knowing that this step would mark her irrevocably. She whispered, almost to herself, the symbolic phrase, "I see the unseen." And again, louder, more deliberate, she spoke it, "I see the unseen." The words resonated, vibrating with a weight she had never experienced, as if acknowledging them aligned her with the lineage of watchers, of those who had dared to confront forbidden truth. And in that moment, the world shifted. The shadows seemed to acknowledge her. The hand pulsed with quiet approval, and she knew, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that her descent into the forbidden was no longer a choice. It was destiny. The words hung in the air, vibrating like a key unlocking hidden corridors of her mind. "I see the unseen." She felt a subtle shift within herself, a resonance that made the ordinary world seem flat, lifeless, and incomplete. The hand pulsed in her palm, confirming her initiation, transmitting not only knowledge but instinct, a language of perception she had never known, a code written in centuries of observation and manipulation. She began to see the invisible threads connecting people, institutions, and events, the subtle levers of influence that had shaped humanity since the earliest empires. Every act of obedience, every instinctive response, every whispered fear could now be traced back to a hidden mechanism designed to guide it. And with that realization came both terror and clarity. Humans were not masters of their own destinies, and few would ever perceive the strings that guided them. Yet here she was, tethered to the hand, connected to a lineage of awareness, able to read influence as instinct and foresee manipulation before it took hold. She understood that this awareness was not neutral. It was a weapon, a tool, and a burden all at once. Every choice she had made, every decision she would make from this point forward, carried the weight of insight, responsibility, and risk. She sensed the silent, invisible watchers, the architects of control, the custodians of power across generations. They knew she could perceive them now, and that knowledge alone made her both dangerous and vulnerable. And then came a deeper, more personal revelation. The hand was not only a vessel of history and manipulation but also a teacher of self-mastery. To navigate the hidden world safely, she had to align her mind, sharpen her perception, and cultivate an instinct for influence and intent. The shadows seemed to respond, deepening around her, almost sentient, as if the room itself were a crucible for transformation. She felt the rhythm of the hand embedding itself in her consciousness, pulsing like a dark heartbeat that whispered lessons she could not yet articulate, lessons about hidden agendas, the architecture of obedience, and the psychological frameworks that ensure control. And as she breathed, trembling and exhilarated, she realized a truth she could no longer ignore. The hand was teaching her to see beyond morality, beyond convention, into the mechanics of power itself. And to survive in this realm, she had to relinquish certainty, embrace instinct, and follow the pulse of forbidden knowledge wherever it led, knowing that every revelation would bring her closer to both mastery and the abyss. The hand's pulse seemed to thrum in sync with the hidden rhythms of the world, a secret current flowing beneath the apparent chaos of human life. She realized that civilization itself was laid upon invisible architectures of control, each designed to condition obedience, sculpt desire, and manipulate perception. Wars, governments, religions, and institutions were not merely human creations but instruments in a vast, silent machine, calibrated to ensure that the masses follow patterns without ever recognizing them. And now, with the hand in haze, she could sense the threads of influence, like vibrations on a web, subtle and powerful, connecting generations, families, and leaders into an intricate design that had endured for centuries. Every pulse communicated patterns she could not ignore, codes hidden in art, language, ritual, and law, signals that guided thought, allegiance, and even rebellion, psychological architectures that harnessed fear, desire, and loyalty with precision. The terror of it was immediate and total. She saw herself, all humans, caught in a framework far more precise than any natural system, manipulated from unseen centers of power. And yet, amid the fear, a dangerous exhilaration emerged. Knowledge had a power all its own, the ability to perceive what others cannot, to navigate invisible currents, to anticipate and respond to influence with instinctive precision. The hand conveyed more than observation. It imparted strategy, training, and intuition, teaching her not merely to see, but to act, to interpret, to master what most humans would never notice. She understood that humanity's freedom was largely an illusion, maintained by distraction, ritual, and the subtle orchestration of belief. The hand pulsed again, emphasizing this lesson. Comprehension is not merely insight, it is responsibility, a covenant with truth that carries the weight of centuries of observation and intervention. And she felt the lineage of those who had held it before her, watchers, initiates, those who had glimpsed forbidden knowledge and been irrevocably altered by it. Some had succumbed to fear, some to hubris, but all had been transformed, and now, she was marked as one of them. The shadows around her seemed to thicken, the air vibrating with silent expectation, and she realized with absolute clarity that her life had irrevocably changed. She could no longer perceive the world naively. The machinery behind every act, every choice, every institution was visible to her mind's eye. And the hand, impossibly alive, conveyed one final lesson for the moment. Knowledge is only dangerous if ignored. To survive, to navigate this hidden architecture, she must integrate, adapt, and act, or risk being consumed by the very system she now understood. The room seemed to breathe around her, shadows folding and stretching as if alive, responding to the rhythm of the hand in her palm. She felt the weight of centuries pressing against her consciousness, the accumulated knowledge of those who had held it before, each pulse transmitting strategies, awareness, and the dark lessons of survival. She began to see the hidden hierarchies in human society, not merely governments or kings, but networks of influence older than recorded history, orchestrating events, shaping beliefs, and engineering obedience with a precision that was almost surgical. The hand guided her perception, showing her that the symbols embedded in architecture, the patterns repeated in religion, and the stories told as morality were actually tools of control, each one designed to steer thought, desire, and loyalty without the awareness of those it shaped. She understood the terror of this realization. Humans are rarely free, rarely autonomous, often guided unknowingly by forces whose intent spans generations. And yet, she also felt a perverse empowerment, a dangerous exhilaration that came from being able to perceive the unseen. The hand was not passive, it taught, disciplined, and tested. It forced her to recognize the psychology of influence, to see the levers that move populations, to anticipate manipulation before it occurs, and to navigate the architecture of power with awareness that bordered on instinct. She saw the lineage of control extending back through forgotten rituals, secret societies, and occult knowledge, each thread a chain linking human ambition, fear, and loyalty into an invisible web. And she understood that those who had resisted, those who had failed to navigate it, were erased, silenced, or broken, leaving only the compliant, the cunning, and the perceptive to inherit the secret. The hand pulsed again, more insistently, embedding a rhythm she now felt as part of her own nervous system, a dangerous heartbeat that synchronized her awareness with the hidden currents of influence. Shadows seemed to respond, almost sentient, acknowledging her initiation, and she recognized the first true consequence of comprehension. Ignorance would no longer protect her. To perceive the machinery was to inherit responsibility. To ignore it was to invite destruction. And as the pulse continued, she felt the transformation deepen. Instinct sharpened, intuition became a weapon, and perception extended beyond what she had once thought possible. She was no longer a mere witness. She was becoming a participant in the hidden world, bound to its rules, its lineage, and its relentless, unforgiving logic. And she knew, without question, that there was no turning back from the path she had begun to walk. Her awareness now extended beyond the walls of the room, sweeping over centuries, continents, and civilizations as the hand pulsed insistently in her grasp. She began to perceive not just patterns in human behavior, but the deliberate orchestration of societies, the invisible forces shaping ideologies, economies, and even morality itself. Entire populations had been guided by imperceptible levers, symbols embedded in sacred texts, rituals codified in ceremonies, and narratives engineered to instill obedience while concealing the true structures of power. She understood that control was subtle, often invisible, yet absolute in its precision. The hand seemed to transmit an almost instinctual comprehension of this architecture, embedding in her mind the ability to anticipate manipulation before it unfolded, to trace the hidden intentions behind actions, and to see the invisible hierarchies that had directed humanity for millennia. And with this awareness came the stark, unshakable truth: knowledge is dangerous, and those who wield it unprepared are often destroyed. The hand pressed gently, insistently, demanding she recognize the scale of the system she now perceived, the depth of the lineage that had maintained them, and the immense responsibility carried by anyone who could see beyond the veil. She saw the architects of influence, the secret councils, the hidden societies whose methods spanned centuries, quietly shaping the course of empires while the public remained blind, compliant, and convinced of their own autonomy. And yet, the hand taught her that comprehension was more than observation. It was a skill, a discipline, and a potential weapon. To navigate the hidden world safely, she would need to internalize its rhythms, anticipate its manipulations, and cultivate a mastery over perception that few could survive. Shadows seemed to deepen around her, almost alive with recognition, acknowledging her transformation, her initiation into the dangerous continuum of watchers who had come before. She understood the paradox: the closer one approaches forbidden knowledge, the heavier the burden becomes. And yet, power lies precisely in the ability to perceive what others cannot. And she felt it in her bones, the inevitability that she would never again live in ignorance. The hand pulsed, and she sensed that her identity was no longer entirely her own. She was now part of a lineage, a network of awareness that spanned centuries, binding her to the machinery of influence, the hidden levers of control, and the dark, unrelenting architecture of humanity itself. The pulse of the hand became a rhythm she could feel in every nerve, a subtle guide teaching her to perceive the invisible forces shaping human behavior. She saw that what humanity considered chaos was often meticulous design, rebellions anticipated, loyalties engineered, fears amplified and contained, desires carefully cultivated, all flowing along channels invisible to those who refused to see. Institutions she had trusted, governments, religions, courts, revealed themselves as components in a vast psychological architecture, maintained across centuries by unseen hands and perfected through ritual, manipulation, and subtle coercion. The hand communicated lessons of discernment, the ability to read influence, detect manipulation, and predict outcomes before they occur, to navigate the hidden currents that guide decisions, behaviors, and entire populations. And in that awareness, terror and exhilaration intertwined. She realized that knowledge itself is power, but untempered power is perilous. She began to perceive the lineage of control, the hidden orders whose practices shaped not only history but consciousness itself, passing down methods, symbols, and rituals designed to preserve obedience and invisibly shape the course of nations. The hand pulsed again, each beat a reminder that she was no longer merely a witness, but part of this continuum of perception, bound to the dangerous knowledge it imparted. And then came a darker recognition. To hold awareness is to inherit responsibility. Ignorance once protected her. Now, understanding exposed her to danger, demanded discipline, and required mastery of both self and perception. She could see the subtle levers hidden in architecture, art, religion, and politics, the psychological triggers that guided entire societies, and the rituals that encoded compliance into generations. Shadows seemed to respond, the air thick with unseen acknowledgement, as if the world itself sensed a transformation. And she realized, with a cold clarity, that she could never return to naive perception. The hand's rhythm embedded itself in her consciousness, a heartbeat that aligned with the hidden currents of control, reminding her that comprehension was inseparable from action, and mastery inseparable from survival. She felt the first stirrings of instinctive recognition. To see is to act, to navigate the machinery is to adapt, and to ignore the truth is to perish. And as the pulse continued, she understood fully that she had become irrevocably entwined with the lineage of watchers, the hidden networks of influence, and the dangerous, precise architecture that guides humanity without ever revealing itself. She felt the hand tighten slightly, not in force but in intent, as if pressing her further into comprehension, deeper into the mechanisms that had quietly dictated human history for centuries. The pulse she now felt was more than rhythm. It was a language, a map, and a measure of power. Every subtle movement transmitted instruction: how to detect hidden agendas, how to trace influence through layers of society, how to read human behavior as one reads a coded manuscript. She began to see the architecture of manipulation everywhere, the subtle nudges in public discourse, the rituals woven into everyday life, the symbols designed to invoke loyalty, fear, or desire with imperceptible precision. And the terrifying beauty of it became clear. Civilization itself was an intricate network of control, maintained by those who understood the rules and obscured from those who did not. The hand pulsed, embedding not just knowledge but instinct, and she realized that comprehension alone was insufficient. Mastery was required. Without it, the knowledge would consume her, overwhelm her, and leave her vulnerable to the same system she now understood. She felt the lineage of those who had held the hand before her, individuals who had glimpsed forbidden truths, some enlightened, some broken, all irrevocably altered, and she recognized the peril she now inherited. Every observation of human behavior, every insight into hidden influence, was now a tool and a responsibility. To ignore them would be fatal. To misuse them would be catastrophic. Shadows shifted as if alive, acknowledging her initiation, while the hand's pulse became a guide, aligning her perception with the currents of hidden power. And she understood that knowledge is not a gift but a covenant, binding, demanding, and relentless. She was no longer a mere observer. She had become a participant in the machinery, tasked with navigating, anticipating, and, when necessary, manipulating the same currents that had shaped humanity for millennia. Fear, exhilaration, and an almost sacred clarity intertwined within her, and she knew that every step forward would test her discipline, her courage, and her understanding. The hand pulsed again, silently commanding her attention. Comprehension is dangerous, mastery essential, and ignorance is no longer an option. She was tethered now irrevocably to a hidden world of influence, control, and forbidden knowledge, and the descent, once begun, would not be halted. The pulse of the hand became a living rhythm in her own veins, and she realized that it was not only teaching her to see, but to feel, the hidden currents of influence that had guided human behavior for millennia. Every subtle decision, every act of loyalty, fear, or desire, was now legible to her as if the world itself were a manuscript written in invisible ink. She saw the hidden councils that orchestrated revolutions, the silent architects behind the rise and fall of empires, the rituals that conditioned populations to obey without question, and the symbols that conveyed authority without force. And she understood, with a mixture of awe and terror, that these mechanisms were far more ancient, precise, and enduring than any human institution she had ever trusted. The hand pulsed insistently, embedding instincts, teaching her to anticipate manipulation, recognize hidden levers, and perceive influence before it acted. Knowledge alone was no longer sufficient. The hand demanded comprehension and mastery. Without discipline, the awareness would destroy her, leaving her vulnerable to the very system she now understood. She felt the lineage of watchers press upon her consciousness, the silent history of those who had seen and survived, or failed, in the same currents. Shadows deepened, alive with acknowledgement, as if the room itself recognized a transformation. And then came the darker, more personal truth. Perception carries responsibility, and power without prudence invites destruction. She sensed the subtle, invisible signals in the world, the cues that guided behavior, the triggers embedded in thought and action, the invisible choreography of compliance and rebellion. The hand pulsed again, insisting on recognition, and she whispered, a ritual echo to solidify her awakening, "I see the unseen." And again, louder, reverently, she repeated, "I see the unseen." The words vibrated through her, fusing comprehension with instinct, and she felt the transformation settle deeper into her mind and body. From this moment, ignorance could no longer protect her. She understood, viscerally, that she was now part of a hidden lineage, bound to a network of perception and control that had existed far longer than recorded history, and that every step forward would demand mastery, courage, and the unflinching acceptance of forbidden truths. The descent was no longer a choice. It was a destiny. The hand's pulse was no longer merely external. It had become part of her own rhythm, a dark cadence threading through her thoughts, instincts, and perception. She could feel the architecture of influence everywhere, the subtle nudges in conversation, the ritualized gestures of power, the symbols embedded in art, architecture, and language, all orchestrated to shape behavior across generations. And she understood, with a chilling clarity, that control is rarely overt. It is precise, invisible, and devastatingly effective when concealed behind illusion. Entire civilizations had been molded this way, their obedience cultivated, their fears harnessed, and their choices anticipated by architects of influence who operated from the shadows. The hand pulsed again, embedding in her an instinctive comprehension, a map of manipulation, and the capacity to trace intent in actions that others perceived as chance or free will. And she realized the depth of a transformation. She was no longer a passive observer, no longer simply a witness to history. She was now a participant in the continuum of hidden knowledge, a member of a lineage whose awareness made them both powerful and vulnerable. Every instinct she had trusted before was now a tool, a signal, a key to deciphering patterns invisible to the uninitiated. Shadows deepened around her, alive with expectation, and she sensed the silent acknowledgement of those who had walked this path before her, their experience flowing into her consciousness, warning, guiding, and demanding discipline. And with that understanding came a darker, almost suffocating truth. The machinery of control is patient, relentless, and omnipresent. To navigate it without mastery is to be destroyed by it. Fear mingled with exhilaration, clarity with terror, as she felt the pulse of the hand embedding itself deeper, syncing her perception with the hidden currents that guide humanity. She understood that the knowledge she now carried was dangerous, intoxicating, and irrevocable. Once seen, the world cannot be unlearned. The hand conveyed one final lesson for the moment. Awareness is both weapon and responsibility, and to ignore the rhythm of influence is to surrender to forces far older, far stronger, and far more precise than she could have imagined. Her descent into forbidden understanding was no longer optional. It was complete, irreversible, and already reshaping the very core of who she was. The pulse of the hand had become inseparable from her own, a living conduit through which she perceived the hidden forces shaping every aspect of human existence. She felt history, not as events, but as deliberate orchestration, empires built and destroyed, revolutions anticipated, populations guided by invisible currents she now instinctively understood. The hand transmitted instinct, strategy, and awareness, teaching her to anticipate manipulation, to detect hidden agendas, and to trace influence through generations. She realized that most humans live in carefully constructed illusions, believing themselves free while their thoughts, fears, and desires are calibrated to serve unseen purposes. And yet, she now saw the machinery, the levers, the codes embedded in symbols, rituals, and traditions designed to enforce compliance while concealing control. The shadows around her seemed to thrum with life, acknowledging her initiation, recognizing her as a participant in the lineage of watchers who had endured centuries of observation, transformation, and peril. The exhilaration of perception mingled with the suffocating weight of responsibility. Knowledge was intoxicating, but it demanded mastery, discipline, and courage beyond what most could summon. The hand pulsed again, rhythmically, as if testing her resolve, and she understood a terrifying truth. The world of ordinary perception was gone. She could never unsee the patterns, the subtle manipulations, or the deliberate orchestration of behavior that shaped every layer of civilization. And yet, she also recognized the opportunity. Awareness had made her dangerous, perceptive, and capable of navigating the hidden currents that few could even imagine. The pulse became a guide, threading her perception through the web of influence, teaching her to move unseen within it, to anticipate action before it occurred, and to wield understanding with precision. And she realized the ultimate paradox. Power lay not in domination, but in comprehension. Mastery lay not in control over others, but in understanding the mechanisms guiding them, anticipating outcomes, and surviving where ignorance would destroy. The hand pulsed once more, insistently, and she whispered the phrase again, sealing her transformation. I see the unseen. The words resonated, vibrating with centuries of knowledge and danger, embedding themselves as instinct. She had crossed fully into the realm of forbidden awareness, bound to the machinery, the lineage, and the relentless, unflinching architecture of power that governs humanity from the shadows. The pulse of the hand had become inseparable from her own heartbeat, a living rhythm that threaded through every thought, every nerve, every perception. She felt the machinery of humanity in its entirety, the invisible levers of power, the hidden networks of influence, the rituals and symbols that shaped civilizations for centuries, and the architects who operated from the shadows, unseen yet omnipresent. Every act of obedience, every impulse, every rebellion, now registered as part of a grand, deliberate design, precise, relentless, and impossible to escape. The hand pulsed again, not as an object in her grasp, but as a teacher, a guide, a conduit for knowledge that was too dangerous, too intoxicating, and too profound to be contained in words alone. She realized the full weight of her transformation. Her perception had expanded beyond the ordinary, her instincts now aligned with currents invisible to most, her mind capable of tracing influence, predicting manipulation, and understanding systems that had governed humanity for millennia. Fear and exhilaration intertwined. The enormity of comprehension pressed against her chest, heavy and undeniable, yet exhilarating in its promise. She understood that the hand had chosen her not by chance but by readiness, a readiness to inherit the lineage of watchers, the secret network of those who see beyond the veil, who perceive the hidden rules, and who navigate influence with skill, instinct, and courage. And in that realization came the ultimate truth. Ignorance had protected her, but awareness bound her irrevocably to responsibility. To hold knowledge is to wield power. To ignore the lessons embedded in the pulse is to be destroyed by them. Shadows seemed to breathe around her, alive with acknowledgement, and she sensed the lineage of those before her, their experience and peril flowing into her consciousness, guiding, warning, and demanding mastery. The hand pulsed one final time, a heartbeat merging with hers, and she whispered the phrase with reverence, certainty, and the weight of initiation. I see the unseen. Twice, she spoke it, sealing her awareness, and the world shifted, revealing its machinery in stark clarity. She was no longer who she had been. She was now a witness, a participant, and a master of perception, forever bound to the hidden currents of influence, the architecture of control, and the dangerous truths that govern humanity from the shadows. The descent was complete, irreversible, and total, and in the silence that followed, she understood with terrifying clarity that the world she had known was gone, replaced by the cold, precise, and unyielding reality of forbidden knowledge, a reality she could never unsee, a reality she could never leave, a reality she now commanded.